Good morning. Would like to welcome you to this event organized in a hybrid format by INCIPE, the Club of Madrid, and the Embassy of Canada in Spain, with the title Disinformation as a Weapon of War. We have the honor and the privilege to have as main speaker to His Excellency Mr. Danilo Türk, former President of Slovenia and President of the Club de Madrid, and Mr. Peter Lowen, Professor Lowen, Director of the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy from the University of Toronto. After the intervention of both speakers, we will open the floor for Q&A. Kindly remind the audience that you are more than welcome to formulate your questions to the speakers in person. Identify yourselves first for those who are following the activity here in this meeting room today, or using the chat tool in the INCIPE's YouTube webpage. We will collect all the questions from the audience in the room and those who are connecting remotely. Since we plan to conclude today at approximately 1:15, I highly recommend you not to wait to formulate your comments or questions until the very last moment. And now, before we start, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Juan Lledó, President of INCIPE, to address a few welcoming words. Please, Mr. President.
I'm going to take my mask off, if you don't mind. I've been given 3 minutes, so I'll try to be very brief. So let me welcome all of you who are here, and all of you who are now seeing us and listening to us through screens, as this is our first, I understand, hybrid debate or conference. And let's hope it works. I'm sure it's going to work beautifully. It is obviously a privilege for me, as president of INCIPE, to welcome our partners in this event from El Club de Madrid and the Embassy of Canada. It is an honor, obviously, to have with us today His Excellency Mr. Danilo Türk, President of Club de Madrid and former President of Slovenia. Welcome here, sir. Welcome here, Mr. President. It is a great honor to have here in these premises Mrs. Wendy Drucker. I've been practicing your name. I don't know if I said it right. Ambassador from Canada, here in Madrid, Spain. Madam Ambassador, welcome here. And welcome our guest speaker from Toronto, Professor Peter Lowen from the University of Toronto, and obviously our very, very good friend, my family friend and personal friend, Maria Elena Agüero. Welcome, all of you. Just a few words, quick words. We're meeting today to discuss a topic of paramount importance in the middle of this unexpected and terrible situation, which is the war against Ukraine. A topic, disinformation as a weapon of war, which obviously relates to manipulation of information, influence and control of public opinion, and influence and control to justify what has no justification whatsoever. Disinformation has become, probably was there before, but it has become today a very important weapon of war. It is obvious that the effect of this war will have long-lasting and terrible consequences for Ukraine. And I'm sure it will affect all of us. But let me be optimistic. And let me be optimistic as a father of kids. Well, they're not kids anymore. They're in the late 20s, 3, which will have to take the lead of all of this after this whole and terrible war is solved. because I'm convinced that at the end of this, reason will prevail. And out of the ashes of this conflict, I'm convinced, let me stress that a free and independent Ukraine will come, and a stronger and freer world will come after this, and definitely stronger and more unified Europe. I'm very much convinced. That's the positive side. So let me finish again thanking all of you for INCIPE, which I'm the president here. It's a truly honor to have been chosen by the Embassy of Canada and the Club de Madrid for this very important event. I'm looking forward for a successful event. So therefore, let me give the floor to Professor Garrido, who's going to be the MC on this event. Professor Garrido, Vicente, you have the floor.
Now I kindly ask Mrs. Maria Elena Agüero, Secretary General of the Club de Madrid, to take the floor also for some welcoming words. Thank you.
Bueno, buenos días. Good morning. Let me first of all thank our host, Juan Lladó and Técnicas Reunidas, for receiving us so warmly and generously to discuss a very timely issue. And as Juan has pointed out, we are longtime friends and we have worked together with Técnicas Reunidas, but also with INCIPE. And I'm sure that the topic that we are discussing today, disinformation as a weapon of war, is timely, but it is in all of our minds today. And much more in our minds than perhaps it was when we started organizing this event with Professor Garrido several weeks back, because unfortunately the war has escalated, and we are now in a completely different scenario, perhaps from what we were when we started planning this. I'd also obviously like to thank Vicente Garrido, with whom we have collaborated, and in whose events that he so masterfully organizes in INCIPE, we have participated, and our members have participated over a number of years. And also Ambassador Duker and the team from the Canadian Embassy for their collaboration, the support, and the trust in this process. Now, also, I'd like to thank President Danilo Turk, who has already been introduced, and Professor Lowen from the Monk Institute. We are just initiating a partnership with the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy from the Club of Madrid, and we hope this is the first event, and we hope this will be the first of many, where we will not only be looking at and discussing issues of global concern, but also issues where hopefully together scholars and experienced leaders can make a difference and support. In our mission, in the mission of the Club de Madrid to strengthen democratic values and practice, we have been addressing the growing challenge of disinformation for a number of years now. Disinformation has always existed, and it has always been a weapon of warfare. But what is new is the depth and breadth of its use, facilitated by digitalization, by artificial intelligence, and certainly by the growth of social media. The spread of fake news has, in the last few years, generated increasing concern among the global democratic community. And as you know, or I hope you know, the mission of the Club de Madrid is intimately related to fostering democratic values and democratic leadership. So this is why we have been looking at the phenomenon of disinformation for a number of years now. With the war in Ukraine, obviously the tension and the perniciousness of disinformation has become alarmingly evident and even crude, taking us back to a powerful tool of propaganda, pure, simple propaganda as a tool, and as a tool to win the narrative, whatever it may cost. Now, the groundwork for Russia's invasion of Ukraine was seeded by a mass disinformation campaign that has continued and grown as the conflict escalates. In anticipation of and as a pretext for the invasion, pro-Russian online disinformation campaigners flooded the internet with images and videos depicting Ukraine as the aggressors. And this has continued as the war has escalated, or at least this is what most of us are seeing. Now, as Russia entered a full-blown military invasion and the destruction of of Ukraine in what has come to be known as hybrid warfare, combining traditional and non-traditional combat strategies, we see disinformation in the midst of this, or in the background. And in spite of efforts to counter the disinformation, it's been tremendously difficult, amongst other things, because of the volume of the disinformation and the volume of the, well, through media reporting and social media, and therefore it is a very pressing problem. But even in a peaceful and non-war situation, the new reality of disinformation in our century, in this 21st century, is accompanied by other threats that are related to the distribution, or how this information online is distributed, and not just by the volume. Threats such as how content algorithms generate echo chambers that can push citizens into ideological one-sidedness and increase polarization, or how anonymousness fosters the spread of hate speech. These are elements, or these are threats that are there and that go beyond the volume that we were referring to before. Now, citizen access to information, we know, is a fundamental pillar and element of democratic societies, and so is information integrity. And the concept of information integrity is also something that I'd like to refer to and hope that we will be referring to during the discussion today. The exercise of political rights, from electing leaders to expressing political and even policy views, requires citizens to have access to reliable, balanced, and complete information on current affairs, on government action, and political actors. There is an urgent need to set up new structures to understand and respond to the complex relationship between information integrity, online communication platforms, and political processes. And many are focusing on this. From the academic front, from the policy-making front, there are many that are today focusing on this. And so we also have to sort of get through and filter and understand all of the information that is out there also on this topic. Now, online anonymousness, zero-cost publishing, and zero-cost retransmission favor the spread of political messages. Very convenient, and we know that this is a positive development in terms of our digital transformation and just the transformation of society. But this also includes fake news, hate speech, extremist and polarizing narratives. And this meets with greater, or presents to us greater challenges, greater hurdles. And many of these other areas receive less attention, or would have received less attention in a non-digital world than they receive today. So addressing misinformation and the threats to information integrity in the digital environment, or in a digital environment, is a complex task for policymakers, riddled with technical complexities and sensitive considerations related to freedom of speech, to the truth of ownership, to liabilities, to the lack of consolidated global structures and tested resources from which to draw. An additional complication is, of course, speed, the rapid pace of change in the digital environment. Not only must government intervention to protect information integrity respond to the threats known today, it must also anticipate the evolving nature and the types of threats likely to emerge in the near future. This underscores the importance of agile decision-making and makes it more important to increase and intensify the interactions between the politically savvy and the technically knowledgeable. Information integrity, therefore, is of the essence. It's of the essence when we address the challenge of disinformation. And it is also of the essence in everyday interaction, societal interaction. It is all the more so in times of conflict. But it is a rare commodity. especially in times of war. I'm sure President Turk and Professor Lowen and all of you who will hopefully be participating actively in this discussion will be adding and addressing the challenge of disinformation as a weapon of warfare. And I thank all of you, those of you that are present here today, and as Juan was saying earlier, at least for us, one of our first face-to-face, in-person gatherings. Thank you very much again, and also those that are joining us online through the streaming service. Thank you very, very much.
And finally, I would like also to give the floor to His Excellency Mrs. Wendy Drucker, Distinguished Ambassador of Canada to Spain. You will be also introduce Professor Peter Lowen for his introductory remarks. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone in the room and online. And thank you to the Club de Madrid and INCIPE for co-organizing this event. We're very, very pleased at the Canadian Embassy to collaborate with you on this. And this topic in particular, because it is obviously a very timely topic, and it's strategically important for Canada, disinformation as a weapon of war, because it reaches into three important elements of our foreign policy agenda. Perhaps the most important one being our commitment to stand with Ukraine, which is a commitment from a number of democratic countries, including, of course, the EU and Spain. We all agree that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a blatant violation of international law and the rules-based international order. And it was preceded and continues to be supported by a steady outpouring of fabricated claims and unfounded allegations, conjuring up false narratives to corrupt the information environment and set out an alternative reality, in fact. And it's also been accompanied by the silencing of dissenting voices online and offline. In addition, Canada is the chair of the Freedom Online Coalition for this year, for 2022. And as chair of the coalition, we lead a group of 34 governments united by our belief that the same human rights people enjoy offline must be protected online. Our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mélanie Joly, has condemned Russian state-sponsored disinformation campaigns in Ukraine as they undermine peace, prosperity, and individual freedoms. And we support the international community in detecting, correcting, and calling out Russia's state-sponsored disinformation campaigns. We've also been working to enhance strategic communication capacity in Ukraine and build the resilience of Ukrainians to disinformation since 2019. And we're now committing additional support to enhance strategic communications capacity there and to build the resilience of Ukrainians to disinformation. And this is a theme that Canada has supported in other repressive regimes for a number of years. We're also currently chairing, we've just taken over the chair of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, or International IDEA, which recognizes that disinformation is a growing challenge, not only in this context of conflict, but it's a challenge to all democracies who really rely on a shared set of facts to support public debate and decision-making. Our chair of International IDEA will focus on the challenges of disinformation for democracy. And tackling this challenge of disinformation, of course, goes hand in hand with our efforts to strengthen democracy in the face of rising authoritarianism. I just want to take a minute to acknowledge our partnerships with Spain as a steadfast ally in standing with Ukraine, in the Freedom Online Coalition and International IDEA. And of course, events like this one today just highlight the important role of civil society and academic institutions in fostering a culture of awareness on the challenge of disinformation and being critical of what we hear and we see. So I'll just move on to introduce Dr. Peter Lowen, who we're very, very pleased to have here. He's the director of the University of Toronto's Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, which is leading foreign policy, a thought leader on foreign policy in Canada and on international issues. Dr. Lowen's background covers Canada from coast to coast, with degrees and fellowships from Mount Allison University in New Brunswick to University of British Columbia, the Université de Montréal, and now, of course, he's at the University of Toronto, and he's held positions at leading universities around the world, such as Melbourne, Princeton, and Stanford. And he is a point of reference with the Canadian media on international issues. Very pleased that he's here and participating in this event, and I will pass it over to the experts now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here, for this opportunity to talk about misinformation as a tool of war. It's certainly my pleasure to be in Madrid to do it, and to do it with the Club de Madrid. And I thought I might just say a few words to start the conversation to give you a sense of how I view the nature and the spread and the market effectively of misinformation. And I do this as a scholar who's very carefully, for the last number of years, been leading a large research project in Canada to understand how misinformation enters the Canadian media ecosystem, how it gets consumed by individuals, and then how it affects their behavior and their views of democracy. And I thought I might just put on the table for you 3 observations that might help the conversation. The first is that, misinformation has many different sources. Some of them certainly are foreign governments who want to inject ideas into others' bodies' politic. But a major source of misinformation is that there is a market demand for it. And I want to give you an example for this. The vast majority of Canadian misinformation in Canada on vaccines, for example, comes from a very small number of websites in the United States. These websites want to generate traffic. They're simply commercial enterprises. There's nothing, what they say is wrong and dangerous, but there need be no conspiracy to understand how these websites have been created. The more people who come to them, the more money they make through views of their ads. What gets published on those websites gets accelerated and passed through via social media, via platforms that are self-promoting of information which is controversial, which gets eyeballs, which leads to engagement on these websites. So this is a major challenge in that when you're thinking about where misinformation is coming from, some of it is certainly coming from strategic sources, but some of it is just that some people like to inject mistruth into our system because there is a market for it. The important thing to note about it, though, is that there's not a market for everything. In the last 2 Canadian elections, there has not been very much information in our system. The main reason being American websites won't make much money creating misinformation about Canadian elections. Not that many people are interested in Canadian elections, as it turns out. But if you want to talk about COVID, vaccines, a war in Ukraine that's taking the attention of everyone, that's certainly a source of misinformation.
We'll see if this works with a bit less feedback. So the first thing to understand is that there just happens to be a large degree of a market element to this. The second point is that it's important that we recognize that what we're talking about with misinformation effectively is a challenge of ideas. And I want you to just think about this for a second, because we often imagine that there is first and foremost a technical solution to the problems of misinformation. If only we could get Twitter to shut down some accounts, or we could get service providers to deny service to some websites which are sources of misinformation, we could cut it off at its core. That's a very narrow way of thinking about the problem that we have here. Instead, what we've got. Oh. I think it's on mute. Yeah. I suspect it might be your microphone.
I think mine is okay. Mine is okay.
Okay. Well, let's persist and see if this goes away. But the second is that what I want you to understand here is that misinformation is a set of shared ideas between people about the world. It's a set of beliefs, and confronting that requires much more than just shutting down some of these sources. In fact, people are okay at creating their own worlds in conversation with one another if they want to believe something. So there's major constraints if we think that the solution to misinformation is going to be simply at a technical level. We're missing that what we're talking about fundamentally here are ideas. And at the core of that are a set of citizens in our countries who want to believe something other than the truth. They're motivated to believe something other than the truth. They're motivated to no longer trust what we see as central sources of trusted information, governments, public broadcasters, large media organizations, and instead they're turning, and they're actively turning, to other sources of misinformation. Importantly in that, those sources are correlated. So people who believe, for example, in the Canadian data, but it bears out in other parts of the world, people who believe that COVID is overstated as a problem, that maybe there's a conspiratorial source to COVID, are the same people that believe that vaccines are not efficacious and shouldn't be mandated, for example. There are also people who are much more likely to believe that there is some other explanation for why Russia is invading Ukraine than the explanations that we all know to be true. They believe that there is some conspiracy behind this. Why is it that the same people believe all of these things? Well, part of it is because they're getting their news from a small number of disreputable sources that we have a hard time keeping track of online because they're constantly morphing. But the other thing is that at a much more basic level, they've lost trust in institutions, in core media organizations, in politicians, in universities, and other sources of expertise to provide them with the truth. So at the core of that is a sense of disaffection and distance from the center of our societies. And that creates a massive demand that's met by that market for misinformation. So these are much more than technical problems. These are there are commercial problems on the production side, and there are massive societal problems of trust and disaffection that are driving demand for this misinformation. And it makes us fertile ground for nefarious actors like China and China in some cases, and certainly Russia. But it also makes us fertile ground just for people who are happy to be disruptive in the information ecosystem by creating lies that people consume for the sake of them being able to get eyeballs on their websites. So what I want to and I'll turn the conversation over to President Turk now. But what I want to impress upon you is that, you know, there's that analogy that if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and I'm concerned that as we think about misinformation, we focus too heavily on the technical solutions to these things because we think that this is the way to address this. It is addressing a symptom, but it's a much deeper, more complex, and in fact, much more worrying set of problems that are driving this polarization in our society that's pushing some people to simply reject the core facts that the rest of us understand to be true. It requires much more than a technical solution. So thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to now introduce President Danilo Turk. He's been already, sorry, thank you very much, Ramon. Thank you for that. One forgets someone has it on and one forgets to put it on. So, no, thank you. One of well, let me introduce President Danilo Turk. He's already been introduced, but he is the president of the Club de Madrid, former president of Slovenia, but of course had a previous life as well, a very rich one in terms of having been an international law professor and also Assistant Secretary General at the UN on political affairs when Kofi Annan was UN Secretary General. So his experience is vast, and the experience that he brings not only to the Club de Madrid but to all of our activities is also enormous, both on the national front and on the international front. So, President Turk.
Thank you very much, Maria Elena. I hope that the technology works now, that it will be adequate. And I would like to, express, first of all, my satisfaction and excitement by being here at INCIPE, a very prestigious institution, which brings the questions of defense and security closer to the questions of political development, political issues that have to be addressed in the society. and which is an institution that will probably have a lot of work to do in the future, in particular in light of what we heard from Professor Leuven, who spoke before me, about the depth of societal problems that can be detected in the current situation, which is characterized by, as the title of our seminar or our discussion suggests, disinformation, a weapon of warfare. Now, I'm very pleased that Professor Garrido is here as an international lawyer, because some of my remarks will relate to that, and I hope he will be able to help us in the course of the discussion. What I would like to say by way of introduction is this. The title of our meeting suggests a kind of a dual nature of the question of disinformation. Disinformation is a traditional weapon of war. This is nothing new about that. I mean, if you just think about Napoleonic Wars and Napoleon's innovation in the Journal d'Italie, which was in his early wars a major source of information and interpretation of war for the Napoleonic purposes. We can think about the whole further development which has made propaganda and disinformation a very important factor. But this is not something that we should focus on today, because we have to see this as a part of a broader and deeper problem brought by the digital technology, which has really created a new world and which offered the new opportunities for use and misuse. Now, I would like to address this problem from a particular point of view, and that is disinformation a prelude of a broader cyber warfare? Or should we think about that also in terms of a broader, wider, deeper cyber warfare? Obviously, digitalized propaganda, disinformation, creation of fake news and all that, that creates a society, an atmosphere in societies and in the world more generally. And then, of course, the use of social media is a major factor. But that's not the end of the story. The question is, where does this go further? One of the things that one thinks about, and I think about simply as a consumer of Twitter, is there much micro-targeting going on in this particular situation? We have seen ex post facto the devastating impact of micro-targeting in the case of Brexit, and also, if I may say so, in terms of American elections. We have seen the techniques of micro-targeting which were developed at that time, having a huge effect on the political outcome. The question today is something like that going on now? Do we know enough about that? Of course, we are all consuming the news, the information that is coming, and we are at the same time consumers and participants in the process, but we don't know if there is a more effective plan behind it, or more effective aspect which we do not fully understand as yet. Micro-targeting is one thing. And then the next question is, what comes next if this is a beginning of a cyber war? And what do we mean by cyber war? What other instruments might be applied? Attacks through the internet system that would demobilize societies, that would create huge disruptions in systems of electricity, public administration, hospitals. Can we expect that? And is somebody there to think about those potential dangers and potential responses? Or is it too early or not necessary to think about that? That's another question, and I believe that institutions like INCIPE have to be aware of the problem and think about it, not necessarily immediately in the case of this war, but certainly for the future. And then, of course, question of controls. I would also like to mention. Does the world have a sufficient basis to think about cyber warfare and instruments of cyber warfare also in terms of potential controls? Cyber warfare is different from the classical kinetic warfare, the warfare which is based on either conventional weapons or even on nuclear weapons. I mean, there, of course, it is possible to establish the source of attack and the target of attack. Here we don't have that. Here the whole thing is very widespread, and there is no clear sense of how does one control this process, if at all possible. In a way, this is similar to chemical weapons, where, you know, when once applied, they create a huge impact all over the place and completely uncontrolled. So I think we have to think about that too. And of course, we think about this at a time when the terminology, even terminology, is not settled. What do you mean by cyber warfare? What kind of instruments are there? And are they amenable to control mechanisms which we can imagine today? And we cannot imagine everything. Now, I have followed the work in the United Nations, including on the questions of cybersecurity now for some time, and I have seen that, in fact, even when it was possible to reach a degree of consensus, it was not possible to go very far in the understanding of what cybersecurity entails. It's in fact almost tragic to see how a consensus document is limited to the need for states to exercise self-limitation and responsibility in cyberspace. And that is, it seems, the concept that really can be basis or point of departure for any future regulation, arms control, or whatever we can imagine for the future. Now, these are my opening remarks. I wanted to build on what Professor Leuven has said and explain that the whole problem is even larger than he defined. And obviously, institutions like INCIPE are well placed and expected to help. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Peter, I'd like to ask one first question. You brought the issue of the market and a market take, let's say, on the challenge of disinformation, and you mentioned you know, that massive societal polarization, or that massive well, societal problem of trust that leads to polarization to a certain extent. Now, this is two levels, the national level and the international level. Now, at the international level, do you think, or what would you think are some of the guardrails that can be put in place in order to, well, limit the capacity of disinformation as a weapon of warfare? Thinking, as President Turk has just put on the table, that we also have to think of cybersecurity in this sense, and that even broadens the scope further.
It's a great question.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. It's a great question, and I would say that let's just think about it from the level of platforms. So Twitter, Facebook, in particular, and just say a couple of things about it. There are a very large multitude of different regulatory schemes which governments are trying to apply to Twitter and Facebook, effectively to regulate our online harms. And my own reading of this, having looked at it pretty deeply, is that we need to think about these from an overall perspective, and you need to put an emphasis, you need to put a requirement on platform technologies to try to reduce the total amount of online harm that they are generating. And effectively, that's an auditing function of saying, you know, like, let's find a way for you to measure how much hate speech you think there is on your platform, or how much misinformation you think there is, and we don't expect you to eliminate all of it, because it's going to be very difficult to do it, because these platforms rely on people talking to each other, but we want you to get the levels of it down. That's in contrast to an individual level perspective, which says we want to allow people to appeal to these platforms when they have themselves been subject to an online harm, and have the platform then address the issue. That's too cumbersome. It's not nimble. It will ignore the fact that these platforms will change over time in terms of how they generate attention and engagement. So we have to take it from an overall level and say, what we need you to do is just turn down the temperature as much as you can on these things, and effectively put in place a good auditing function. That's difficult for governments to say, because what they're doing is they're effectively saying, we can't regulate you as much as we want to, but we want you to self-regulate. But pragmatically, that's where we are. The second thing is, this has been touched on a little bit, is that the most damaging thing that Twitter and Facebook are doing is eroding the market power and the resources of traditional media companies. And we can talk about whether traditional media companies deserve to have the market power that they had and the control that they had over advertising, but the reality of it is that they are the engine of the production of truthful information in our societies. Governments will never be as good as a good newspaper at delivering stories to people that people will read. They'll never be as good as a television station at delivering news stories, which are for the most part factual because of journalistic norms, in which people will read. And the way platforms have eroded the revenue base of media organizations is a major issue here. And a lot of countries are trying to figure it out. But we need to recognize that there needs to be a sustained source of revenue for media organizations to be able to do the work of covering events and producing truth that we can all consume and can share with one another. The third thing I would say, and this will get into cyber warfare as much as it gets into information warfare, is that we have to figure out how countries like Canada and Spain and Slovenia and other countries engage in this democratically. We can get into the business of unconstrained cyber warfare if we want to, that is interfering in the information flows of other countries, that attacks infrastructure. There's no lack of capacity, I'm sure, in the West to do this, but it's important that when we do these things, we do it in a way that reflects fundamentally what our values are, that we ought to have people engaged in truthful, factual discourse with one another, and that we ought to abide by international law when we're doing these things, because the world is watching. Effectively, we tie one hand behind our backs against other countries, but to be seen to be doing this in a way that's consistent with our values is the exact opposite of what a country like Russia is doing, and there's a moral and a normative imperative for us to do this in a way which respects the fact that we are democratic countries. So you have to be pragmatic in how you regulate those media companies. You've got to reinvest in media and in the production of shared stories as best possible, and we have to do all this in a way that's consistent overall with the values that we're trying to sell to the world.
Thank you. I have also a question for opening the debate for Mr. President, for President Turk. How should democratic nations respond to this disinformation challenge that is currently highlighted by the narrative surrounding the war on Ukraine? And what role can political leadership really play?
Well, this, of course, is a big question, and one which, in fact, invites a multitude of answers. There is no single answer to that. There is no simple answer to this. And, of course, there is a point of departure that can be defined with some precision, and that is, well, responsible leadership and truthfulness and commitment to the basic values of democracy. I mean, that has to be demonstrated in practice. I mean, we have had a long period of time before the current escalations, which were really very rhetorical. And when we talked about values of democratic societies, that was largely reduced to rhetoric. Practices of democratic societies were often very different from the lofty talk about values of democratic societies. Now is the time, and that's for the democratic leaders to realize that they have to live the values they preach. And that really is very important right now. That is the way to establish trust, which is necessary to lead societies credibly and with success. So that's the kind of point of departure which is very clear. Now, of course, after that comes the question, all right, what is the agenda? What are the main main topics that need to be addressed, not in an academic sense. We're not going to theorize about democracy. We have to implement democracy in these difficult circumstances. And of course, here we will have to address some of the very serious questions. And I would like to open two of them, just by way of example. Again, building on what Professor Levin has already told us in both of his sets of remarks. Now, one of them is the question. We now see that democratic countries have blocked Russia Today and Sputnik. And we have to ask ourselves, is this good? Switzerland has not done that. And of course, there are Russian channels which we can see. I can watch them in my hotel in Madrid. But the question will remain and will have to be answered at some point. Was it wise to do something that looks like censorship. Now, you know, freedom of expression and rejection of censorship has been a key to development of democratic societies. And I know that because I come from a country that is going through a transition from a situation where controlled expression was the rule, not very harsh, it was quite soft control, but it was still control, to freedom of expression societies. And of course, this kind of questions will have to be asked at some point. I understand that when a military conflict starts, there is a strong pressure to kind of limit what is apparently propaganda. But then the problem still remains and will have to be addressed. That's one thing. The other thing is understanding the world. Again, a challenge for democratic leaders. We have to know that not everywhere in the world the opinion about Russian aggression is the same. If one takes the example of India, and I have discussed this with some of my friends in India recently, there is a very widespread support for Russia in India, and one which is actually promoted by the government, so they say. I'm not sure, I can't guarantee that that is the case, but the feeling of very well-informed people in India is that, yeah, sure, there are political calculations which are very strong in a democratic society, and India likes to praise itself as the largest democracy in the world, and of course is not sharing the same narrative as the Western transatlantic community is kind of sharing. So we have to look at that also, and that is also a task for responsible leaders in the democratic world who would have to find a way of addressing issues in a manner that makes the world a better place for everybody. It would be probably wrong to simply say, well, India, you have to understand things better and should refrain from this kind of logic, this kind of narrative which is currently prevalent. So how does one do that? How does one engage with countries which actually which are also co-creating the world of the future in a manner that would make the world a better place? Big issues, and all of them are open now. I mentioned just two examples, and all of these questions are open now and put before the leaders of democratic societies.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, we have a lot of questions. Let me pick up the first one arriving through the chat online, and I am sure that we will have also some questions by the audience here in this meeting room. Álvaro Manrique, who is a student of international relations at the King Juan Carlos University, Spain, asked, during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have seen measures such as a ban on Russia Today and Sputnik from operating in the European Union. Are really these actions effective against disinformation? Could they not fire back? Whether Professor Leuven or
well, I have said something already about this, so now maybe it's Professor Leuven's moment, and I can come back if necessary.
Yeah. It's a very good question, and I'll answer it in a couple of ways. In Canada as well, we revoked the broadcasting license of Russia Today, which was carried on a number of cable networks, and you know the democratic basis for that is that Canadian media space is not free. You know, you apply to get a license, and it is a regulated space, and there are a number of criteria which broadcasters have to meet. And it was the government's feeling that they could rule that television station was not meeting those criteria which have been set democratically. That's a technical answer to what is really a values question, which President Turk has brought up. In some ways, it doesn't matter whether you ban RT or not, because people can find the information in other places, and that's the point about these things being ideas. Ideas have a very effective way of eluding regulation, don't they? Because you can find other people who are propagating the same ideas on the internet somewhere, and you can try to shut down every source of pro-Russian information on YouTube, and you cannot keep up with it. The rate at which regulators can watch videos is slower than the rate at which videos are created. And certainly the rate at which conversations happen on Twitter is much faster than the rate at which regulators can look at them. So you have to decide whether you want to deal with these things at the level of shutting off the source of information totally, or to ultimately to confront the ideas head on, in combination with maybe with platforms shutting things down algorithmically. I don't have a problem with the Canadian government, frankly, shutting down RT across our airwaves. It's an arm of the Russian state, and Russian state has no business accessing Canadian airwaves or Canadian broadcasting space or bandwidth. But we shouldn't pretend that that's the only solution to these problems, because the problem is much bigger than just one television station, as well produced as it is.
Please, Mr. President.
Well, I would only propose, no, things have happened, and there are reasons why they happened, and there are rules that have to be applied. I don't have a problem with that at all. I only see a need to look at the experience at some point in the future. Let us assume that this war will be stopped by a ceasefire and a prolonged period of uncertainty, which is a possible scenario. I can't predict a scenario, but let us assume that the most egregious part of this war is over in a month or a couple of months, and that then there is a period of uncertainty which will be very long. What would make sense in those kind of situations? Would it make sense to continue the ban, or to use the RT channel, for a fight of ideas? This is something that Professor Levin advocated earlier. I mean, ideas have ways of penetrating which evades the regulation. So I think that question will have to be looked at very seriously. That's all I can say at this point. If we have a discussion in 6 months from now, I'll probably have a more precise thing to say.
Thank you. My good friend Gonzalo Ceballos from the Ministry of Industry.
The mask off?
Yeah, please. It's Ministry of Industry and member of the Spanish Atlantic.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the introduction. I don't have to do it myself. Yes, I'm currently working at the Ministry of Industry, but as a civil servant, have gone through quite a lot of ministries. It's mind-blowing what you are mentioning in disinformation, and I would like to challenge you with a couple of sort of factual things. One is you're mentioning ideas as what is the content of disinformation, when ideas themselves cannot be related to truth, fact, or reality. Those would be scientifically, they would be based on facts, on reality. The values of democracy are based on basically discussion, discrepancy. And one of the things that Peter mentioned, which is possibly new in this disinformation process, is not the fact that there is disinformation available. It's the fact that people willingly want to take that disinformation. I would say in our democracies, I don't know the numbers in Canada, but the highest political right that a citizen in a democracy has, that's a voting right, isn't actually used by many of our citizens. Why do we think that they had to be good citizens taking the right information, and we ourselves address the correct or the incorrect disinformation, when we know, and you've mentioned it in the social media, that lies are more attractive? Truth is quite disappointing. Truth is not nice. Lies are good, they're attractive. Possibly there's even a DNA thing in our brains telling us where danger is, or things that stay in our brain far more than nice, attractive, sweet things. My question would be, in this disinformation debate, do you believe that democracies have to just take the burden that we're going to always navigate in greys, not whites and blacks, and that we will have to rely on individual leaders of the democratic countries to do their best in matching deeds and words with what they do, and education of our citizens in having access to proper information and disinformation, and being capable of contributing to the country they live in, taking whatever they think is better.
Thank you, Gonzalo. It's always a pleasure to learn with you British English. Really. Yeah, okay.
I think it's a wonderful question. I mean, I think we have to have debate. So let me ask you the following question: Is it a fact that the invasion of Ukraine is unjustified? Well, that's not a matter of fact. It might be an international law. It's a political question, and I happen to believe that it is unjustified. And I think that if we prosecute the arguments, we'll see that it's unjustified. But that's not something that can be fact checked, right? And get into the domain of COVID, right? What is the best public health response to COVID? Well, that's a matter of debate where we're weighing up different values and trade-offs. And what we have to be very careful of, I think, in democratic societies is we think that the way to deal with disinformation is to rely on truth, which it is, but it's not enough to rely on things which are simply fact, because many of these things actually need to be prosecuted as arguments. So what we need is political leaders who are willing to stand up and prosecute an argument that citizens can understand about why the invasion of Iraq is unjustified, about why public health measures against COVID are justified, about why democracies are good places. We have to have leaders who are ready to make arguments time and time again to citizens, because that's what the other side is doing, actually, right? When they're putting out all these things. So we're not in the. There are facts, of course, in the world, right? But what we're talking about is people's beliefs and the set of beliefs that we think that they should have around what's going on in the world, and that has to happen at the level of ideas, not at the level of regulating what's said on some platforms or not on other platforms.
Something to add?
Well, I generally agree with Professor Levin. Again, what I would like to add is this. We live at a time of great transformation, great social transformations globally. And of course, prosecuting an argument is very important in this context. And democracies have to live up to the challenge that is there and have to invent new ways and new convincing arguments to persuade that democratic societies offer better solutions. I mean, this is not something that you can take from a textbook and have a ready-made product. I mean, that is something which will require a great deal of political argument and political battle. And that's where we are. And that's why we need leaders. That's why we need discussion. And that's why we need to fight for our ideas. But I would like to mention another aspect of factuality, which I think is quite interesting. You know, it would be interesting to do the auditing, I mean, on social media and compare, for example, two different communities. One is the anti-vaxxer community, which I think is very large in all societies globally, and the pro-Russian community, which is actually very small. And I think this factual analysis could also be interesting, not to replace any of the political needs that we have, but simply to know and not to overblow the problem. I think that the vast majority of people are shocked and disgusted by the way, by the whole vision and performance of Russian military and this completely unjustified use of military force, a complete case of aggression. And that creates a very different type of debate from the one which is, of course, much more open-ended, the question of vaccines, the best health policy, and so forth. We have to take this quantitative analysis further into the questions of the communities that participate in social media. And this is important also for one very fundamental reason. When we talk about citizens and kind of, I don't like the word education of citizens. I would like to say kind of empowering citizens for a political process in democratic context. Then I think an important understanding here is that for many years by now, citizens were reduced to the consumers. You know, citizens were mainly consumers. Now they have to be agents. The question of citizens' agency is really at the center. And that is what democratic leaders have to know and to figure out how they're going to lead the process.
Thank you. Let me pick up another question arriving through the chat by Jimena Lopez Navarro, who's following us from Paris, student Sciences Po Paris, Law and Business. She said, Professor Lowen, you mentioned that technology isn't sufficient to counteract disinformation because this only addresses the symptoms of disinformation. But what can we do to address the root cause of disinformation, namely the increasing disaffection and distrust towards our society?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'll just say is that it's a good question, and the solution I think is what President Turk has just said, that we need to recognize that this is principally about two things. One is about showing citizens that democracy actually works, that it does deliver on the things that it says it's going to deliver on, and democracy is under more competition now than it has been in the last 30 years. China offers an alternative model. Russia offers an alternative model. I wouldn't choose them, but they're offering alternative models, and there are other states which are coming up with their own configurations, which are non-democratic but are delivering to their citizens. Often less than democracy, sometimes more. It's a competition over ideas and over results. And then there's another way of putting what President Turk has just said, which is that citizens have responsibilities, and I think that we shouldn't, in democracies, we shouldn't let them off the hook too much, right? And part of the discourse when we're talking about how media is perpetrating misinformation and how we're all susceptible to it ignores that citizens actually have a responsibility to come to the right ideas on their own, right? And that's part of them being not only consumers or passive recipients of information, but being citizens and being agents who are responsible for their own beliefs. That's not the most hopeful message if you're a politician delivering it. I don't know many politicians who would want to deliver that message, but it is a reality that at the level of educating people and students and young citizens, that we need to teach them again what it means to be democratic citizens, to live in disagreement with other people sometimes, and to be responsible for the ideas that you have and the ideas that you share.
Okay. I think we have Gabriel Cortina. I couldn't recognize you with the mask, but you are. Okay, Gabriel is the president of Article 30, so we're a deputy analyst on security and defense issues.
Thank you. From a different perspective, we talk disinformation as a weapon of war, but what about as a weapon to protect, as a weapon to deterrence, and I think also, as a tool, we can use it to protect our interest. What do you think about that?
Well, I must admit I haven't given much thought to this question of information being a deterrent or instrument of deterrence, except that obviously, if information is an instrument of truth, it can have a deterrent effect, and that is something that we have to develop further. Now, you see, in the past military conflicts, we have come to a point at which criminal justice was seen as a very important instrument to end an illusion of impunity or to end these situations of impunity and create a kind of a preventive, one could say, deterrent effects. Justice in those situations, including in the Balkans, in the West Africa, and other places, was not only about punishment, it was not only about ending impunity, it was also about the truth. how does one come to the truthful explanation of what has happened? And information on that sort of thing is not going to be believed just because it is available. Sometimes you need a strict legal process to determine what the truth is. And that's an illustration, that's an example which shows you how important and how difficult it is to argue for the truth. I mean, and we have to be aware of that if we talk about information as an instrument of deterrence. So that's one aspect which I think has to be looked at and studied further. You know, we are meeting at an institute, and these sort of things are really worthy of very serious analysis, which has not been made as far as I know. And then there is an older political experience which can also be taken into account, and has to be understood how democracies function in situations of war or difficulties which, you know, lead to war. I was recently reading a biography of Clement Attlee, the labor leader in Britain from 1930s onwards. And it's interesting to see how a mature democracy and genuine democratic leaders have found solutions, have found answers to the problems of the moment. It was the Labour who supported Churchill to become Prime Minister of Britain in the time of the darkest hour. It's an incredible political achievement. They were able to rally behind a conservative leader for a particular job that had to be done, and which was really an existential threat to Britain. And then after the war, when again the Labour was able to articulate a policy leading to creation of national health system. The working class has taken the greatest burden of war, and it has to be protected better. And that also succeeded. So what does this experience teach us? Democracies have the capacity of bringing leadership to the forefront that finds answers to the huge problems of the day. And today we have a different problem. But there is no other way out than finding the right kind of leaders who will be able to articulate solutions. And those solutions would probably require better use of information, better support for quality journalism as an important instrument of truth. Again, better use of legal systems and judiciary as instruments of truth and so forth. All these are challenges today, and all of them have to be addressed and solutions found. Thank you.
Okay, well, Alfredo Sanz asked about war against disinformation for a liberal democracy should be essentially defensive. But this means we have to do something else, maybe. And Jose Ortega, at the second question that I think we can put together as a measure to control the fake messages in social media could be made by the owner companies of the platforms. But where are the limits of this control?
It's a fair question. I mean, the second question effectively is asking to what degrees these companies can themselves limit false information. There's a different way of thinking about it, actually, right? Which in some sense is to audit and poll what people's beliefs are in a society. So if we're concerned, for example, in Canada or in Spain, if you're concerned about misinformation about why Russia is in Ukraine, there's two ways you can deal with that. You can try to deal with multiple ways, but here are two ways. You can try to deal with the very thorny problem of trying to locate misinformation online and somehow regulate it, or you can just talk to citizens and say, what percentage of them actually believe this lie that Russia's invasion is justified? And if the percentage is 3 or 4%, don't worry about it, right? Move on. Really move on to another source of misinformation. Vaccine hesitancy would be one that you should address more seriously. So there's different ways of looking at this problem, and I think that we think we can regulate social media companies, so we want to do that, rather than actually asking to what degree some of these beliefs are widespread enough that they actually do represent a problem. That requires much more of a kind of an ecosystem study and an ecosystem sort of view of what's going on in media and in the information ecosystem, much more than a regulatory one. And the other thing I'll just note, as a person who's done a lot of experimental work on fact checks are very good at correcting a person's beliefs literally for about 2 days. And then their beliefs revert back to what their beliefs were before, because they either want to believe what they believed before, or they put themselves back into that bath of information that was already making them believe those things. So you can fact check people, but it's as a parent of a 6-year-old, it's a bit like talking to a 6-year-old sometimes. You have to repeat it over and over again before the message gets heard.
Okay, 2 last questions. Sorry.
Just one word. You see, I agree, but then there is also another dimension. I mean, the responsibility of owners of social media platforms. As an independent question, what constitutes their responsibility? I mean, they are not the media themselves, they don't have exactly the same responsibility, but they have some kind of responsibility. And so far it seems this whole question was blurred by the fact that at the end it was monetization that mattered. Other things were not really all that important, but now I think we are in a situation where the question of responsibility has to be put very simply and very directly to the owners of social media platforms. And ask them to provide answers, simply because that's necessary in a democratic society. The question of controls and regulation is a separate question, and that, of course, is for government and for the state. But that doesn't make the owners of social media platforms not responsible for what they are providing.
If you can briefly introduce yourself.
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm Juan González Barba. Until 3 months ago, I was Secretary of State for EU Affairs, and yesterday I've just been appointed ambassador to Croatia. So I'm very grateful to Professor Loven for having raised an issue which I think is critical, that of conspiracy theories. And I've been, half of my diplomatic career, I've been dealing with North Africa and the Middle East, a part of the world ripe with these theories. And at the time I thought that the best antidote against these conspiracy theories was transparency, the sort of transparency we have in democratic societies. But then, here and during the time I was Secretary of State, I was realizing to what extent there is a growing tendency to accept among our electorate this sort of shortcutting way of thinking. And I would like to know your opinion about 2 of the reasons I would attribute to this tendency in our Western societies. One is that we have to review the whole concept of political leadership. It has to go hand in hand, I believe, with social leadership. Somehow the normal path to become a politician is no longer enough in order to generate trust among our societies. That's one thing. And the second thing that I see as a growing danger for us is the existing polarization, because somehow there is an invisible wall that precludes this possibility of passing on messages to the rest of society. So I think there is a duty on behalf of all mainstream political parties to lower the tone of confrontation. But I don't know whether you think there are other keys to try and combat conspiracy theories in our midst. Thank you very much.
It's a very good question. I think your intuitions are very good. I'll just say two things about it. There are a lot of studies on why people consume conspiracy theories, and there are a couple of big drivers. One is some people have a psychological predisposition to conspiratorial thinking. They're just distrustful, kind of naturally, right? And that's fine. You know, there's a lot of different people in the world. But the second one is it has to do with people's generalized levels of trust in the core institutions of their societies. So how does that relate to polarization? Well, the element of polarization which should be most worrying to us is that the polarization between political parties, which is a natural and often healthy thing within a democratic society and in the democratic competition of ideas, is increasingly spilling over to people's feelings about one another. So the way people feel about the partisans of other parties is more, in Western democracies, is more negative now than it was 10 years ago and 20 years ago. The way the people want to date or marry or have as friends is increasingly structured by people's political beliefs. That's an awful way to live, but it's increasingly the way we're living. So imagine a person who is distrustful of society, but believes not only are the political elites not on their side, but that there's a whole faction of society around them, their neighbors, the people they work with, who also aren't on their side, who can't be trusted, who are supporting parties that are not out there to support them, but are out there to get them. That becomes a very, very fertile soil in which distrust can grow. So the challenge we've got with polarization is that not only does it push people away from fellow citizens and from fellow parties, but it pushes them into the arms of people who want to tell them that the whole system is something much darker and much worse than you can imagine. You know, and once you're in that mindset, the attraction to anti-vax positions, to disinformation about other states, to disinformation about the world economy and how it operates, it all starts to run together in a way that allows people to put themselves into information environments where they're really in another world at that point in terms of what they believe. So one of the obligations then on political leaders is to, as much as possible, to turn down the temperature of political rhetoric and to just remind people that politics is a very thin slice of life, and ultimately the people around you are not defined by their politics; they're defined by all the other great characteristics of people. That's very hard for politicians to do because, you know, it's a self-feeding cycle. As polarization gets worse, the incentive to appeal to that affect of polarization gets even higher. But a major byproduct of it now is desire for conspiratorial thinking, if not just for information silos.
Thank you. We had much more questions, but we are already late, which is a good signal. Always the seminars are successful if we have some delete, and this is definitely a question of Admiral Trevino about cyber warfare. I think was already answered by President Turk, and the question of Lydia Hernandez deserves another half-a-day seminar. What can we do to recover the trust in institutions by the citizens? This is another seminar, maybe. But thank you very much, both, and please, Maria Elena, before we give the floor to Ambassador Manuel Alavar to close this seminar, if you want to give the floor to our panelists again.
Well, I could give the floor to the two panelists for a final word, but I really do think that we're late. And so if you don't mind, unless there's something more that you really want to add, but I, just as a last word, want to thank all of you and thank INCIPE, thank Técnicas Reunidas, but also all of the participants for all of the questions. We've touched upon values, we've touched upon practice, bringing values to practice. We've touched upon some of the challenges that are in this information ecosystem and disinformation and information truth, trust, elements that are central to democracy. But we've also touched something that I would like to suggest could be another reason for or a topic for another meeting, and that's leadership. Because leadership and democratic leadership is what the Club de Madrid is all about, and it's as a suggestion because it has come up in the questions and also in some of what we've heard from our speakers. I think it would be very interesting. So, Ambassador Alavar.
So, thank you, Ambassador.
My dear friends, in-house and online participants, what an interesting session this was, thanks mainly to the stature of our speakers. May I sum up what has been said, stressing that for our Western societies, for Europeans, for our public opinions, the debate on misinformation and disinformation as a weapon of war is here to stay. It has been used well before today's war in Ukraine, but perhaps only now our societies are fully aware of its importance. of its viciousness, of its relevance. The difference perhaps of today is that we are now paying a lot of attention to it. And today's timely session is a clear proof of that. And it is a problem in the wider realm of cyberwar. Tragic actions like the conflict in Syria and the downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 in Ukraine have taught us the value of establishing the truth of information, and information shared from open sources such as social media in conflict zones. But it is only now that we are fully aware that we have to adopt measures to counter their very ill effects and address a problem which is way deeper than merely technical. These possible measures have been initially outlined by our speakers. Our priority has to be always to find the truth. And this purpose demands the proper use of digital technologies and artificial intelligence to advance peace and democracy and to establish international guardrails to contain misinformation. And above all, we need strong political and social leadership to this effect, a leadership that will promote democratic values and freedom. Because let's face it, this is a huge challenge for our democratic societies and, as it was said by our citizens, which are not only consumers, but have to be agents. May I thank, therefore, the President of the Club of Madrid, Mr. Tusk, Professor Leuven from the University of Toronto, of course, the Ambassador of Canada, Mrs. Drucker, for their very illuminating remarks. Please consider all of you INCIPE your home. The presence here today bodes well for the future collaboration of the Club de Madrid and INCIPE, a cooperation that will rely on the experience and thoughtful work of people like María Elena Agüero from the Club of Madrid and Professor Vicente Garrido of INCIPE. Many thanks to both of you. And finally, thank you very much to all our participants in-house and online. So long, we all hope to see you back here soon. Thank you.